Okay, the next presentation is from Amanda Doughty, and Amanda's a livestock behaviouralist. I'm interested in this. I've had a hobby breaking in horses, and I think this is a very interesting. I've always tried to have a conversation with a horse. Often didn't work, but it's a useful thing to think about. How can we communicate with our animals? So please welcome Amanda Doughty.
Okay, we won't go near that. All right, as you said, thank you. I'm Amanda. I'm a livestock behaviour and welfare researcher with the University of New England. And it really is loud, isn't it? Sorry.
And move forward in front of the...
Is that better? Oh yeah, you're picking up both of them.
Right close to you. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, so yes, I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that I'm doing looking at livestock monitoring and specifically looking at the welfare of sheep and extensive systems. So this is sort of fits between what David was talking about and what Brad's going to talk about later, how we develop some of the tools that can be used. So a very brief history. I know there are quite a few producers out here already, but obviously shepherding and sheep herding originated in Europe and Asia, and basically because we didn't have fences around the areas we were keeping sheep, then we needed to have these kind of people out there all the time. It was generally a nomadic or a solitary existence, and they looked after the health and welfare of the sheep and looked after the feeding and moved them when they needed to. So as far as shepherding in Australia goes, sheep first arrived in 1788. They were, same thing, run in large unfenced areas. They were exposed to predators. They possibly needed assistance with looking after health issues, particularly perhaps at lambing. They needed to be moved to different pastures, but again, without fences, we actually needed people out there to do that. And interestingly, shepherds in early Australia were some of the first people to be interested in production increases. Now this I found a while ago. This is about I think about the late 1800s this was written, and it's basically just a description of an Australian shepherd. So you're talking about a man, mature years, bronzed, weather-beaten face, straggly locks, unkempt beard and a battered felt hat. So I think he looked a bit like this. It's possible, I'm just saying it's possible he looked a bit like that. Not sure. All right, what do modern stock people look like? They can ride horses. Chances are they'll also from time to time drive around the paddock looking at the sheep, looking at the food, the water that's available to them on their motorbikes. Chances are they'll use dogs both in yards and outside of yards. And because we have that gap now, we don't have shepherds out in the paddock all the time. Obviously we don't need to as much with the fencing, but we don't have people out there 24 hours a day monitoring these animals. Some people are starting to bring in things like guardian animals, Maremma dogs and alpacas to actually assist with the monitoring of the sheep. So we've identified a bit of a gap, all right? We could do with a bit more monitoring of animals. So this program that I'm working on at the moment is part of the Sheep CIC's Enhanced Sheep Wellbeing and Productivity program. And the aspect that I particularly work on is behavioural changes related to wellbeing. So visually, the aim of all of this is that if we have a sheep that's okay, and then something happens and she's not okay, then we can send an alert to a producer who has an option to go out and do something if that's what they want to do. So the idea is to produce a tool that the producer can actually use. And one of the constraints that we had was that we wanted to produce a tool only really using the technology that was readily available to producers. So I'll get to that in a minute. So that's the bit that I focus on. And what are the behaviours that occur when an animal, and particularly a sheep in this example, goes from being well to being unwell? So the indicators that I'm looking for are basically what's termed iceberg indicators. And what I'm looking for is a few behaviours that are really easy to pick up and that you can use, and they really tell you something about what's going on underneath. So I want sort of some general behaviour changes that can reflect a lot of things happening underneath. I need them to be stable, I need them to be repeatable, because what I'm looking for are behaviour changes. So if the behaviour is not stable to start with when the animal is well, becomes unwell and the behaviour changes, then it's too much individual variation. I need to be working with some stable behaviours so that when the animals, something happens to them, I can actually pick up those changes in behaviours. I need a short lag time. It's no good me being able to pick up a behaviour 3 weeks after something's happened to the animal. I'd like them to be automated or remote, however that might work, and I need them to be really producer friendly. On-farm adoption is one of the biggest issues that we face, And I don't have any easy answers for it, but it really needs to be something that's simple, that's not time consuming for a producer to pick up and to play with. So this is some of the stuff that I have been looking at. Basically all of it was trying to figure out if what I'm looking at is stable to start with, and then does it change with illness or with welfare compromise. So roll call, movement order and social networks. Basically I'll summarise, roll call and movement order didn't work very well. Roll call is do all the sheep turn up to a certain point in time in a certain time frame, perhaps within a day or two, say for a watering point. And movement order was how do they move around a paddock? Do they always move in the same order? Chances are the ones at the front do, but the ones at the back are a bit more flexible, and then some of the front ones move. There's a lot of individual variation there. So they didn't work so well. Social networks works a lot better. Essentially, if you're trying to grasp your head around the concept, it is basically Facebook for sheep. So what you're looking at is if you've got two sheep, how often are they together? If they're separated by other sheep, how many sheep are in between those two individuals that you're looking at? And what I wanted to know was what's the stability of that network like? And if I do something to the animals to make them unwell, does that stability change? Does the social network change with animals that aren't feeling very good? So I'm going to talk to you about the social network stuff that we did, and then roll on to just quickly to a few other things that I've been looking at as well. So the aim of the social network experiment was to take some sheep, put them into mobs, and let them set up those social networks. Then we added some barber's pole larvae, some Homunculus contortus, to some of the animals. We wanted to see if they would maintain those same social networks, or if over time, given that level of parasite infection, that they would change the social networks. So this experiment and all of the other stuff we've done has been based around a controlled traffic zone system, which is simply controlling the animals' movements in and out of or for a resource that they are very motivated to obtain. In this case, it was food and water. So all we do is set up fencing around, say, a watering point and control the access. So the animals have to go in at one at a time. We used EID technology for that, and we've used a lot of different readers, but we essentially focused on the Pedigree matchmaker for that one. We had 200 sheep, 4 weeks training, and we took 20 days of baseline data. The summary is we did get some worm egg count differences between controls. The worm egg counts themselves were quite low. We did get differences between controls and treatment animals. And we did also look at social networks. We could only look at social networks in the second group, and that's what you're looking at there, the results from that. So the red triangles are the treatment animals, and as you can see, they are a little bit more around the outside. So animals with Homunculus contortus infection tend to be less sociable than other animals. So social behaviours, are they particularly useful? It's a definite maybe on that. I'm a scientist, it needs more work. So they have a slightly weaker social network. I think the way we set it up was perhaps not quite ideal, with a single entry and exit point. And also it took at least 20 days to establish that baseline network. And in an environment where you're possibly moving sheep and moving mobs around, that might not work so well. We've also been doing some video image analysis work, looking at trying to identify lameness through image analysis and looking at demeanour, so head positions, back positions, to try and pick up animals that aren't well. We've done some work looking at temperature change, microchips implanted in the skin under the skin to see how well they reflect core temperatures, and looking at some thermal imaging for things like fly strike. On-animal sensors, I think, are probably the best chance that we've got. It's probably a combination of technologies, but I actually think that those are accelerometers and GPS collars. But I actually think that probably the on-animal sensors are probably going to be the way to go. This is very briefly some work that the sheep CICS have been doing outside of the stuff I work on. That is quite experimental, some of that behavioural stuff. This is perhaps a little more practical. What they're doing is developing an app, a Wellbeing app, and it's a risk predictor app. So they take a whole lot of historical data and they feed it all in together, and the producer can then go to that app and they can get a risk prediction for worms, fly strike, for temperature, and hopefully some production traits as well. It's based both on an individual animal with EID or on a mob basis. All right, so I think that's the end of what I wanted to say. Basically, as I said, this is a production tool. It's not prescriptive. The idea is that we can hopefully put something out there that will assist the producers in what they're trying to do. Things like increasing monitoring without increasing labour costs. Hopefully if we can increase health and welfare, we can increase things like public trust and retain social licence to operate. But how do you make those decisions to use those tools? I'm going to hand over to Brad now, who's going to talk to you. He's a producer from WA, and he's going to talk to you about some data, how he uses it, and how he makes those decisions to use some of these tools. Thank you.